Tony Blair is the longest-serving Labour Prime Minister in British history. Throughout most of those years in power, Alastair Campbell was the other man in the room. Privy to Blair's innermost thoughts, ambitions and doubts. He occupied a position of unequalled authority and influence. He kept a diary, recording the good days and the bad, the peaks and troughs of political power.
Tony said they know I'm Labour and want to change things. They believe things should pretty much stay the same. We looked shifty and shabby. It was a disaster and getting worse. We were in danger of being seen as a soap opera and not a government. Tony said we have to hold our nerve and have balls of steel.
In the early hours of this morning, Blair and Campbell awoken with the news that Princess Diana, who they were both fond of, has been fatally injured in a car crash in Paris.
We had I don't know how many conversations. We went round and round in circles about what he should say and also how. Just after 7, Tony called again. He'd been working on the words for his doorstep and going over some lines he'd drafted. We agreed that it was fine to be emotional and to call her the People's Princess. Talk about the good she did. He kept saying, I can't really believe this has happened.
The people everywhere, not just here in Britain, everywhere, they kept faith with Princess Diana. They liked her, they loved her. They regarded her as one of the people. She was the people's princess.
This was also going to be a test for him, the first time in which the country had looked to him in a moment of shock and grief.
Waiting to one side are the Prime Minister, the Defence Secretary.
The mood was a bit edgy. I sensed their concerns about where all this was going.
Prince Charles talking to the Prime Minister, who spoke so movingly this morning of the people's princess, who will stay in our hearts forever.
I was hovering near Tony as he chatted to the Lord Chamberlain, and they called me over. The Lord Chamberlain was clear this was an extraordinary situation, and they would find it useful if we could be involved in the discussions about this. Tony volunteered me for the next few days and said we would do whatever they asked of us. Afterwards, Tony set off for Chequers. He called me from the car and said it was clear they didn't really know what had hit them and genuinely wanted help and support. The Herald Tribune's headline was "World Mourns the People's Princess." The phrase had really taken hold and was becoming part of the language. We have to be careful that it doesn't look like we're writing our script rather than hers.
I think it must be very, very cold-hearted not to have a flag up. I think it's a disgrace on the whole royal family.
They had clearly put to the Queen the issue of lowering the flag, but it was a broken tradition too far. The palace press team kept me back after the Lord Chamberlain's morning meeting and said they had a real fear this was becoming the people against the family. I walked back through the park, flowers everywhere. It was heaving with people, yet quiet. I talked to a group of 5 youngish people, 3 men and 2 women, who had come up from Croydon. It was as if they knew her, like there was some kind of intimate bond. I couldn't work out if it was all about her, or all about them, or all about a desire for a new way of doing things. Heaven knows what she would have made of it. She knew she touched people, but she can't ever have imagined this.
I think it's disgusting that they have not appeared or said a word relating to all this.
The royal family responded to the wave of public emotion following the death of the Princess of Wales. It was hurt at suggestions that the family was indifferent to the nation's sorrow.
The mood was really turning against the royals, and everyone seemed helpless in the face of it. It was pretty clear that Prince William really felt strongly about the role of the media vis-à-vis his mother, and would not want to be doing anything that he felt was for them. I was constantly pushing the line that the palace were very much in the driving seat, and we were there with help and support.
Someone is prodding and cajoling the palace into making concessions, and I think that someone can only be Downing Street.
We were never that far away from an interference, politicisation, exploitation line, and we had to stay the right side of the line. In truth, they had delegated a lot of the judgment on this to Tony, and he to me. The Queen had agreed to do a broadcast, and she and the Queen Mum and the boys would visit the palaces and the Chapel Royal. I suggested the visits might involve talking to people in the crowds.
In another unique break with protocol, the Union flag will fly at half-mast from Buckingham Palace during the funeral and until midnight on Saturday.
The afternoon could not have gone better for them. As the Queen walked around in front of the palace looking at flowers and talking to people, you could sense the pressure lifting, the mood changing. The broadcast script was fine.
Since last Sunday's dreadful news, we have seen throughout Britain and around the world an overwhelming expression of sadness at Diana's death.
Tony wanted her to say she was speaking from the heart. I persuaded them to put in speaking as a grandmother.
So what I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart.
The route had to be long to let the crowd see the cortege pass, but that created extra policing problems, and also meant if the princes followed, it was a very long walk. I asked if there were any religious or protocol reasons why, if the coffin was followed, it had to be followed the whole way. There were gasps around the table, then pennies dropped all round. It could go from Kensington Palace. Problem solved. It felt very odd watching it all on TV. I felt very remote from it. Yet I also felt a sense of authorship.
I would like to end by thanking God for the small mercies he's shown us at this dreadful time.
The main event for me, though, was Charles Spencer with his barbs at the press and the royal family. As soon as TB came back, he asked me to see him, even though he had a stack of kings and queens coming for lunch. Hillary Clinton joined us, and Tony asked her how she thought we should respond to Spencer. She said we shouldn't be rushed into anything. This was not a legislation thing. His attack on the royals would be the bigger story.
Tony Blair spoke with the Queen about the events surrounding Diana's death and the lessons that might be drawn from them.
He said conversation was not that easy. They don't know what to make of me. They think I helped, but they also wonder whether my calling her the People's Princess didn't fuel the public feeling. They know I'm not left-wing, but they also know I'm Labour and want to change things. They believe things should pretty much stay the same.
The big question facing Blair is, do we, don't we, join the European single currency? He's basically quite keen, but wants to wait and see how it performs. The Chancellor thinks now is not the right time to join, and it all results in a massive policy cock-up.
Gordon's team want him to do an interview clarifying the situation, saying policy was unchanged but making it clear we were clearly not going to be in the first wave, and therefore it was unlikely for this Parliament. With all the chatter that had been around, I agreed it was probably the right thing to do. It wasn't so much an interview as a form of words for the Times. The Treasury drafted the words, I made a couple of changes.
Good evening. The government's given the strongest indication yet that Britain will not join the European single currency during the lifetime of this Parliament. The earliest likely date for Britain's entry would be 2002.
Tony called after he'd seen the news and said, "What the hell is going on? We never agreed this," he said. I said I thought they had. Gordon was also now on the rampage, saying this had all gone too far, as if suddenly the headline he'd been asking for was not what he'd asked for at all.
Well, I can't answer, of course, for every newspaper that speculates about what the outcome of our deliberations is going to be. There's been numerous articles speculating about that.
Even today, writing this one day after the event, I cannot piece together exactly how we reached the point we did. I was beating myself up too because I knew I'd screwed up. I felt I hadn't done what I normally do, which is double-check every base.
The origins of New Labour's own cash, the promises made to their benefactors, and the Prime Minister's own reputation then came under sustained scrutiny. Formula One boss Bernie Ecclestone gave Labour a massive donation before the election, and after Blair came to power, Formula One was exempted from the ban on tobacco advertising.
Tony immediately sensed real danger. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the policy, which had been worked out by people unaware of the donation, it would look absolutely dreadful, and it was bound to come out.
Downing Street is still refusing to disclose how much money it received from the head of motor racing. The row over a financial donation from the...
I woke to the BBC saying the Labour Party was still refusing to reveal the size of Ecclestone's donation. My own view was we had no option but to get out that it was £1 million. But Ecclestone was opposed to that, and we had to wait till he agreed. It was beginning to look and feel worse.
Why not tell everybody exactly how much money you gave them?
How much do you earn a year?
Well, I'm quite happy to answer that question.
Answer it then.
Ecclestone did then himself reveal the size of the donation.
£1 million for answer.
The £1 million was big in the papers, and we were looking shifty and shabby. It was a disaster, and getting worse and worse as the days wore on.
We slain one dragon only to have another take its place with a red rose in its mouth.
Prime Minister's question time was fine until Martin Bell got up and had a go, to pretty devastating effect. I was really not enjoying this at all.
Madam Speaker, that is precisely why we sought the advice of Sir Patrick Neil.
This nightmare would not go away. Every time we thought we were through it, something else would come up and hit us. Derry Irvine called. He was worried. He thinks he's invincible, he said. It happened to Thatcher after 10 years. It's happened to Tony after 6 months. We had the answers, but I was more worried Tony wouldn't learn anything from this. Cherie said he would. He had obviously told her how pissed off I was because she came in and gave me a big kiss and said he knew he'd handle it badly and should have listened to me.
I'll call you Tony once and then Prime Minister forevermore. Good to see you.
I said he had to reconnect on the basis of trust. Humphreys was full of himself, and I was probably a bit too rude to him. Right. But he was so up himself, it was hard not to be.
Do you believe that as a result of what has happened in this past week or so, you have lost the trust of the British people?
No, I don't believe that. And I hope that people know me well enough and realise the type of person I am to realise that I would never do anything either to harm the country or anything proper. I never have. I think most people who have dealt with me think I'm a pretty straight sort of guy, and I am.
The interview did the trick. The public gave Blair the benefit of the doubt, and the party returned Ecclestone's money.
Cherie and I both emphasised to TB he had to change modus operandi and learn lessons from this. I said I was fed up with all of them, and he said, "You love me really though," and laughed.
Blair's massive parliamentary majority gives him licence to take risks. He invites Sinn Féin to join peace negotiations before the IRA has laid down its weapons.
I shook McGuinness by the hand, and he said, "So this is the room where all the damage was done." It was a classic moment of different histories playing out. We thought he was referring to the mortar attack on Major, and we were shocked.
In Downing Street, the buildings shuddered and windows were blown out as the mortars landed.
Yet it became obvious from their surprise at our shock that he was referring to policy making down the years. No, I meant 1921, he said.
We hope that today's meeting will be a significant step in the search for freedom and justice in our country.
I found McGuinness more impressive than Adams, who did the big statesman bit and talked in grand historical sweeps. But McGuinness just made a point and battered it, and forced you to take it on board. Tony said we faced a choice of history, violence and despair, or peace and progress. We were all taking risks, but they are risks worth taking. He said to Adams he wanted to be able to look him in the eye, hear him say he was committed to peaceful means, and he wanted to believe him.
If you are engaged in a process of talking to people, then at least you've got some chance of a better understanding emerging.
Vera Doyle, the only Irish messenger in number 10, came over to chat to them. Within seconds, McGuinness was charm itself. Vera was clearly a fan, but said to them as they left, "Now you two, just behave and help out our man here."
By spring of the following year, Blair was so frustrated by the lack of progress that he imposed a strict timetable on negotiations and flew to Belfast to enforce it.
We discussed plans for a doorstep on arrival, and I drafted a few lines. But he pretty much did his own thing.
A day like today, I mean, it's not a day for sort of sound bites, really. You can leave those at home, that I feel the hand of history upon our shoulder in respect of this. I really do.
Hell of a soundbite. The press loved it.
But the Unionists have rejected what's on the table. Sinn Féin says it's being asked to concede too much. Blair's public optimism is not matched by his private mood.
I went in to see Tony as he was getting ready for bed. He said his gut feeling was very negative. He couldn't see how to fill the gaps. I got a message to go and see TB before I was even up. He was in the bath and said he was worried. I knew he was worried anyway because he was playing the fool the whole time, putting on a thick Irish accent, pretending he was a newsreader, announcing that Cherie was going to become a Protestant as part of the deal.
All parties advanced and retreated as the day went by, hesitating at the scale of the compromise demanded of them.
unionism cannot dictate the pace, because the pace of unionism in terms of the rights of other people is a snail's pace.
Tony was having to see all the parties regularly just to keep them on board, but the focus was David Trimble. He came in on his own just after lunch. Tony really tried all the charm and the cajoling, and DT was moving, but then moved right back again. Tony and I went for a walk out in the freezing cold. We didn't want to be seen, so just found this little garden and walked around for a few minutes. Tony said, "Do you think we can do this? It would be amazing if we pull this off. I think we can pull it off, I really do."
By late afternoon of the second day, Sinn Féiners complaining that the Unionists looked like winners and the Republicans looked like losers, Blair was running out of patience.
He said, "I don't accept you can't sell this. I appreciate the pressures on you, believe me I do, but this is fundamental change, and you would be mad to turn away from it." Tony was downcast, said he felt they weren't able to get it through their heavies and they were going to fall off the end. "You have to remember," he said, "they are negotiating with at least a modicum of worry. Someone will come along and blow their brains out if they go too far." The midnight deadline we had set just came and went without people really being bothered.
Though things often looked hopeless, Blair kept at it, pushing the parties towards an agreement through the small hours of the morning.
At 4:10, Tony was eating bacon sandwiches and bananas and beginning to look a bit grey.
Dawn broke and Clinton called as arranged to encourage Sinn Féin to close the deal, and suddenly the agreement was there.
An historic agreement for peace in Northern Ireland has been reached within the past few minutes.
If you had to pin me down and ask me to explain how it suddenly came together, I couldn't. But I was in the press tent briefing that basically we had a done deal, that it was huge, historic, ginormous, all that stuff. I could see in some of the Northern Ireland hacks too a real deep emotion and the desire for this to be true.
It's a bloody miracle.
I actually felt like crying but held it together.
I said when I arrived here on Wednesday night that I felt the hand of history upon us. Today I hope that the burden of history can at long last start to be lifted from our shoulders.
I got home, wired and exhausted, and still trying to remember how it all came together at the end.
I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
President Clinton bolstered the peace process throughout, and when he was being formally investigated over his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, Blair was right by his side.
Tony said he intended to be very supportive when we went there, and maybe say he thought it was ridiculous to have this system where someone was appointed at massive public expense to go fishing for dirt on the president.
I would like, if I might, to begin by paying tribute to your president, to his determination, to his statesmanship and to his courage. Bill, I am pleased to call you a good colleague, and I am proud to call you a good friend.
Bill really appreciated it. As theatre, it was virtuoso. As they came out, he took us to one side and said, "I'm going to make sure you'll always be proud of what you did out there. It was a noble thing to do."
the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Clinton and Blair also took their decision to threaten military action against the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, who has banned inspection of his weapons program.
On Iraq, we stand together. Let me be clear, if Saddam does not comply with the unanimous will of the international community, we must be prepared to act. And we are.
They were preparing for an attack, no doubt, and we had to be out there setting the ground for that. We were going to take a political hit on this.
Back in London, the Chief of the Defence Staff briefed Blair on planning for the joint Anglo-American action.
We got the presentation on targeting plans. 96 missiles from B-52s. 300 from ships in the Gulf. They envisaged 1,500 to 2,500 casualties. It was an odd feeling to be shown all this, to know where bombs might be heading, and to know people were going to be killed. I wondered if you ever became immune to that thought. Suspected you did.
Before Tony Blair made him Lord Chancellor, Derry Irvine was a commercial lawyer.
Just as the government was putting the squeeze on public sector pay, the Lord Chancellor chose to spend £650,000 of taxpayers' money on restoring to their former glory his state apartments using hand-printed Pugin wallpaper.
There was a real sense we were losing our grip and a real problem developing, that we were in danger of being seen as a soap opera, not a government.
I believe that it is in a noble cause and that future generations will be grateful. And also,
it was so bad, it was comic, and he seemed to have no sense whatever of how it would be seen.
I mean, the fact is that the man comes over as pompous, as conceited, as vainglorious, and wholly opposed to the quiet, sober, dignified approach that one would expect from a Lord Chancellor.
I loved Derry dearly, but even I found him arrogant and overbearing and pompous.
I certainly do not think that any apologies are due. On the contrary, I tend to side with
the Lord Chancellor is a close friend of Blair's. He trained as a young barrister in Irvine's chambers, but now Blair is calling the tune.
Tony said, "It pains me to talk to you like this, but you are being damaged, and in turn that is damaging the government. You may have right on your side, but how on earth can you call the refurbishment of an official residence a noble f***ing cause?" Later he said what really worried him was that Derry didn't seem to realise it was a problem. He asked if I thought he was rescuable. I said it was difficult.
Irvine survived, but it was the beginning of the end for Social Security Secretary Harriet Harman and her minister Frank Field. Campbell wrote to them, telling them not to squabble over policy in public.
The leaking of Mr. Campbell's faxed warnings to ministers Harriet Harman and Frank Field to stop talking to the media themselves has made him the story. And that isn't good news for
the main problem was the Mail getting hold of 2 letters from me bollocking Frank and Harriet. They were a bit over the top and meant more bollocks about me in the Sundays. I was becoming the story again.
These battles with the press are getting to Campbell, who's worried enough to call his doctor.
He said 3 times in my medical history I'd had major upheavals because I ignored the signals when they first came. Acute asthma, a nervous breakdown, a serious stomach complaint. He felt all 3 were connected to anger. You get all of the shit, none of the glory, and you spend a lot of the time taking seriously people you despise. You wouldn't be human if it didn't make you angry.
Tony Blair's official spokesman, Alastair Campbell, has come under renewed attack from the Conservatives for giving what they say was misleading and deliberately false.
The Prime Minister's Chief Press Secretary, Alastair Campbell, will appear before a committee of MPs tomorrow to face questions on his role and his relationship with Tony Blair. He's been accused of reprimanding ministers, flouting his civil service status and misleading journalists.
The build-up had been pretty steady, and clearly the media were hoping for some big explosion. TB called me up to the flat. He said he hadn't realised how big this thing was being built up. He said, just stay calm and be polite at all times. Be as greasy as you like.
What you said was, I've got it here, I don't know whether you will say you didn't say this, I can certainly say that it's balls that the Prime Minister intervened over some deal with Murdoch. That's crap. Did you say that?
I may well have said that. There was a strong element of it being showbiz, and Rodri Morgan, the chairman, was loving the fact his committee was getting all this attention.
Are you, as it were, more important now than some ministers?
Well, I'm not. In terms of anything that I would say to a minister, it is not me that is speaking, it is the spokesman of the Prime Minister. I didn't feel the Tories had worked through their questions rigorously.
And I would suggest that
they were looking to get coverage for their questions rather than probe properly on the answers.
you have a duty to stamp this out. What are you doing about it?
Well, I can be responsible for what I say. I can be responsible for the attempts to coordinate government activity. I cannot, much as you might like to give me superhuman powers, be responsible for every word that is uttered by every person in this building.
This was an effective performance of the sort that Mr. Campbell would hope that ministers would produce. The Tories failed to draw a line.
I got a good press out of yesterday, both news and sketch-wise, with a general feeling I'd won it hands down. Now the media-obsessed-with-itself line was made flesh with the Sun's attack on TB as the most dangerous man in Britain, running as the second news item on the BBC.
Tony Blair's told MPs he won't be swayed by an article in the Sun newspaper.
These people were never happier than when talking about themselves.
European currency. The Sun, which backed Labour at the general election, accused the Prime Minister of being determined to scrap the pound with disastrous consequences for the economy.
A cabinet reshuffle is planned to clear the air and rebalance the government by removing Harriet Harman and some of Gordon Brown's allies.
By the end of today, the Prime Minister will have all his ministers exactly where he wants them. They're still waiting to hear the news.
We were pressing TB to be bold, but he said, I'm just telling you, there is a case to be cautious if it all ends up with Gordon offside. He said with Peter and others in, 4 out, you are talking a big reshuffle, and I do not want a war with Gordon. I hate reshuffles, he said. You just have to steel yourself, but they're horrible.
Blair's decision to bring Mandelson into the cabinet is risky. He's a controversial figure, and the Chancellor doesn't trust him.
Tony spoke to Peter and said he wanted him to meet Gordon tonight. He said if they didn't work together, he would have to take drastic action because he was not prepared to let them bring the whole show down. He also agreed I could brief that he had told Peter he had to knuckle down and do a proper job properly.
His appointment as Trade and Industry Secretary was a milestone for Mr. Mandelson. The chance to...
Just 6 months later, Mandelson is in trouble. A book written by a Gordon Brown supporting journalist reveals that he borrowed £373,000 from millionaire Treasury Minister Geoffrey Robinson to buy a house, and his department is now investigating Robinson's business affairs.
Tony wavered between anger and exasperation. I hate this. I cannot believe this. The Tories were murderous for it. Yet when I spoke to Peter, he couldn't see it, or at least pretended not to. It was a loan between old friends who go back a long way.
I've done no wrong, and therefore I shall be continuing in my job.
The opposition has said he should resign, but Downing Street says he has the Prime Minister's full confidence.
I told him it had the potential to be a big, bad story, and surely he could see that. He said I was overreacting. I had always been a bit of a Calvinist. So it's a Geoffrey problem, he said. I said it's a Geoffrey problem, but it's also a Peter Grand Panjandrum problem. And it's a GBPM self-destruct at the heart of government problem.
After a week in the spotlight, Mandelson was out of the cabinet.
I felt desperately sad for Peter, who came back in looking wretched. He'd clearly been crying. We were both quite emotional now. How many times had I warned him that what I called his lifestyle ambitions would do for him? His desire to be famous and mingle with the rich and the great and the good. I really felt for him though. We'd had so many moments, good and bad, but when push came to shove, he was still one of the best, and it was a dreadful f***ing waste.
Through my own misjudgment, I have allowed the impression to be created of wrongdoing, and I'm not going to allow that charge to be made against a government which I care more about than anything in the world.
What are your plans?
Peter was discovering that Tony could be pretty ruthless when he had to be.
It couldn't get much worse for Bill Clinton, or could it? A key committee of Congress is in session now, deciding whether to release the 4-hour videotape of him answering explicit questions about sex with Monica Lewinsky.
Tony felt Bill was in some genuine trouble, but the only option for us was to stand by him. I asked Cherie if she would stand by Tony if he got involved with a Monica Lewinsky. She said probably, but she'd make his life hell. Tony said he was confident she'd kick him straight out. Fiona would do the same to me.
Clinton's response to the scandal was to turn his attention back to the Northern Ireland peace process.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President of the United States, Mr. William Jefferson Clinton, and the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Tony Blair.
David Trimble was pretty churlish throughout, and afterwards Bill said to me, someone should tell him that part of the art of politics is smiling when you feel like you're swallowing a turd. Tony said to me later he felt Bill was very down but hiding it well, and also feeling very damaged. A role in the peace process meant a lot to him for lots of different reasons.
The President of the United States tonight stands accused of being a liar and a criminal. The allegations that Bill Clinton is unfit for office are presented in...
When the special prosecutor's report is published in all its lurid detail, Clinton barely allows it to dent him.
Tony's call with Clinton went ahead. Considering what was happening around him, he was amazing. It was as if nothing was going on. Tony, hi. If he was acting nonchalant, he did a great job. Then they were on to Northern Ireland and Russia. TB said, re Clinton, of course he can deal with these things, but the question is whether this is what politics has now become. He said if you looked at any sexual relationship in the context of a report like that, it could be made to look terrible. Every leader had to be able to let go a little.
But when it came to Cabinet Minister Ron Davies' self-confessed moment of madness on Clapham Common, Blair didn't hesitate.
We told Tony what we knew. He looked surprised but not shocked, and then, as I had, laughed. Bloody hell, he said. Ron looked absolutely shattered. He ran through the story, how he had been driving back to London from Wales, wanted some fresh air, stopped at Clapham Common, went for a walk, met a guy, got talking, agreed to go for a drink, met up with some of his mates, agreed to go for a curry, got into a car, got robbed of cash, wallet, car phone, went to police, and here he was. He set it out in a very matter-of-fact way. Tony was in clear and decisive mode and said, the more I hear of this, the more convinced I am that as soon as people hear of this, they will think it all very odd and it will be very hard to explain away. I asked Ron if he had spoken to Chris, his wife. He hadn't. He called her and told her, in the most perfunctory way imaginable, that he'd seen Tony, who had been very nice, and he was probably going to resign and something might be on the news. All right, love? And that was pretty much it.
I was the innocent victim of a crime. The police are investigating that, but in order to minimise embarrassment for myself, my family, and to ensure that this government can get on with the business of governing this country with the very highest standards, I feel it appropriate that I should resign, and that's what I've done.
NATO bombers have been pounding Serbia for 6 weeks to force an end to President Milosevic's systematic slaughter in neighbouring Kosovo, but it's not been effective.
600,000 Kosovo Albanians have been driven out of the province. There are reports of at least 3,500 people being killed in mass executions.
Even hardened aid workers in Albania have been shocked by the arrival of thousands more Kosovan refugees today. They tell horrific tales of murder and brutality.
Blair was in the forefront of NATO efforts to end the ethnic cleansing.
This is not a battle for NATO. This is not a battle for territory. This is a battle for humanity. It is a just cause. It is a rightful cause.
He said the visit to the camps had confirmed him in his view there was no way in the world of doing a deal with Milosevic.
Britain believes there must now be urgent planning to send in ground troops. Even in the event of no clear-cut peace deal, other NATO partners are much less keen.
It's President Clinton who's reluctant to commit ground forces, despite pressure from his close friend and ally, Tony Blair.
We couldn't understand why Clinton, the ultimate empathetic politician, did not seem to get this in the same way as we did.
The impression given by the British press is that Clinton is now a stumbling block to ending the conflict.
The Americans clearly believed we were briefing against them. I tried to explain to the White House that people knew there were differences. The thing was to resolve the differences, not fret and frazzle over who was saying what to whom. I said for us to brief against them would be dumb and counterproductive, because they can always hit back harder.
The president himself then called Blair.
They had spoken for over an hour, and the first 5 to 10 minutes was taken up with Bill in a total rage. He said he knew what was going on, it was deliberate, and it had to stop. He said it may play well with the UK media and public, but there is a price to pay, and you will pay it. Tony said Clinton's outburst was real, red-hot anger. He felt he was just getting a lot out of his system, and he was the only one Clinton could really let rip with. Briefing Tony, I mentioned a story that was running about the menopause, and he suddenly looked pained and said Cherie might be pregnant. I laughed out loud and said I couldn't imagine having a baby at my age, let alone yours. Nobody can complain you don't make news, I said. He said he felt a mix of pleasure and horror. Thank God I'm a Christian, he said. It allows me to assume there must be a reason, even if I can't work it out. What I dreaded was having to deal with all the guff that would come with it. The media would have a field day.
They kept their story quiet for 3 months. The Mirror was first to pick it up, swiftly followed by The Sun. Each of them demanded exclusive rights to the story.
Dealing with The Sun and The Mirror the whole time was like having 2 mistresses. It was a f***ing nightmare. Both thought they were entitled to some kind of special treatment.
The Prime Minister and Mrs. Blair emerged together for the first time tonight since the news of her pregnancy became public.
There was something amusing about seeing all these hard-nosed characters standing outside number 10, going on about babies.
Leo Blair, named after his grandfather, arrived just after midnight on May the 20th, 2000.
I called through, spoke to Tony, who sounded very happy about it. I heard the baby and TV said, "Here you are, Leo. Talk to your spin doctor." The media was going into meltdown on it, leading every bulletin, every spit and fart. Before Tony went out, he was incredibly nervous, but did fine, though they would no doubt have a field day with his mug, which was a picture of the kids. He still underestimated how much they gorged on this kind of stuff.
She's sort of relieved it's over. You know, that's the main thing. And she's just resting now with the baby. But he's been really good.
He was boasting about how he'd been changing nappies. I went up to see him a couple of times and he was just sitting there holding the baby, all gooey-eyed. He and I must have spoken 4 or 5 times during the day, but usually about the political scene, which he was really running around his mind the whole time. He said we had to stay bang in the centre ground. I know I'm right. I am where the country is.
Blair senses the government is losing the support of Middle England and, in a decision that divides opinion in his office, plans to reclaim the centre ground in a landmark speech to the Women's Institute.
I decided not to go because I had a series of meetings, including one with JP. It seemed to start okay, and I turned the sound on the TV down a bit as John and I talked over things.
Saying to Helen just before coming on stage, this is truthfully the most terrifying audience I've ever seen in my life. Gordon Brown and I believe passionately in extending opportunity for all, but neither of us will have...
Over John's shoulder I could see there was a bit of a reaction around the place, and then the clear sound of slow hand clapping and heckling.
I've spent a long time working on the National Health Service. To try and make sure...
Ministers speak out of politeness.
Thank you very much.
I turned up the sound and both of us watched as TV did what JP called his Bambi look. Really startled, but with the smile still there.
Mr. Blair's coming here today proved a public relations disaster. He's already having trouble enthusing...
He called me from the car and said it had been really bad. It wasn't just the slow hand clapping, every element had been wrong. Their main complaint was that it was a political speech, to which I said, what did they think politicians were for? Of course, there was no way we would win a war of words with the Women's Institute.
Things aren't going too well for the government. Talk of
of gimmicks and empty words and empty gestures and public relations exercises, and they're no longer even competent at that. Haven't we seen in the last few weeks that he has now abandoned Middle Britain and that Middle Britain is abandoning him?
Tony said we simply had to hold our nerve and have balls of steel. I said fine, but we shouldn't pretend that because we defend ourselves the whole time, there are not things that we defend that don't actually need changing. He agreed there were problems and said it was possible we were in trouble. His own feeling was that we could lose narrowly.
Tony Blair's powerful press secretary, Alastair Campbell, he's saying there'll be no wallowing or navel-gazing after yesterday, and the message will get through in the end.
The idea that a few women getting up and walking out of a speech somehow represents a sort of seismic shift in, quotes, Middle England, I think is absurd. I have read some guff in my time, but this week, I mean, comparing it...
You haven't read what we've written yet.
No, I mean, I'm on pretty high guff alert for the weekend, that's true. But, I mean, comparing it to the poll tax riots and, you know, the ERM and Ceausescu's fall, I mean, it's pathetic.
When lorry drivers and farmers blockade an oil refinery in protest at the latest rise in petrol prices, it was less easy to spin Blair out of trouble.
We seemed unable to get the police to focus.
does amount to obstruction, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And usually, things that obstruct the road are removed by the police.
Normally, yes.
And in this situation?
In this situation, we're not going to move it at this stage, no.
Tony said at one point that if this was Thatcher and the miners, the police would waste no time wading in.
Protesters pushed their point until the country had almost come to a standstill, and then they called off their action.
Tony felt the media coverage had been an outrage, but he didn't want to say so publicly. It had felt absolutely terrible at the centre, an almost palpable feeling of a gulf opening between government and country.
It was far from an ideal scenario for a government entering what would be an election year.
Tony was both buoyant and down. Down about some of the realities, but buoyant because he felt we were doing the right things and making progress. And also because he had resigned himself to the idea that if we lost, and it wasn't the end of the world. He had clearly been chatting to his maker again.
4 months later, the outlook is no more optimistic. Mandelson has resigned for a second time, and Campbell is under huge pressure from Fiona to give up his job.
I told Tony I was feeling tired and demotivated. I felt I'd given him my best for several years, and I no longer felt on top form, and I wasn't convinced I would recover it. He felt election years always produced this kind of mood. He promised we would be strengthened by a second mandate. Fiona and I had a fight in the car on the way home because it was obvious I was going to stay. The scene was bad all round.
Five more cases of foot and mouth disease have been confirmed today. The crisis is spreading across the country.
An outbreak of foot and mouth disease paralyses the countryside and puts paid to political plans.
Having carefully weighed all the arguments, I've decided that the national interest is best served by postponing these elections until June the 7th.
Despite the enforced slaughter of livestock and sense of crisis, the government is still well ahead in the polls.
Tony said he didn't know how long he wanted to stay in the job, but he felt Gordon was imagining he would go halfway through the second term. The look on his face made it clear Gordon had no chance of that. He seemed genuinely unsure about a third election, but I suspected he would go for it if we had a decent majority second time around.
Blair finally asks for the dissolution of Parliament and kicks off Labour's campaign at a school in South London.
Tony said he still wasn't properly psyched. Maybe once we were out on the road he would get into it.
They weren't voters, but pupils from a Southwark secondary school lined up for his visit, and they treated him like a pop star.
Earlier today, I saw the Queen of Buckingham Palace to ask for a dissolution of Parliament.
It was a bit odd that he was doing a big number on the importance of voting to a group of people who couldn't vote.
My goal at this election is this. It is not just to win your vote. It is to win your heart and your mind.
There was a bit of a scrum outside and the media were pretty cynical about the whole event, but I thought it was just about okay. Mind you, how we kept this cynical bunch of w***ers interested for 4 weeks of this was a question I didn't like to think about too often.
Labour is now desperate to give the campaign a bounce. The manifesto launch is meant to provide it, but luck is running against them. The partner of a very ill patient confronts Blair on a hospital visit.
I'd like to know what your Labour government are going to do. My partner has cancer.
I asked Tony how bad it was. Bad, he said. Bad enough to blow out the manifesto launch? Definitely, he said. I did my best to talk things down, but when I finally saw the exchanges, I realised we had no chance.
Very sorry about the situation. No, you're not very sorry, because if you was, you would do something about it.
And then John Prescott retaliates when a bloke in the crowd throws an egg at him.
I felt instinctively there would be a lot of support for JP, but also that he should say he wished he hadn't responded like that. He was not up for it one bit, said the guy was a total twat. Said it was bloody ridiculous that we had to take all this shit from people just because we were politicians, and he would not be apologising. I admired him for it. The manifesto was disappearing down a plug hole.
With 2 days to go before polling, Tony Blair should be supremely confident. Yet there remains an uneasiness about his campaign.
The campaign never did pick up, though they were still on course for victory.
We had been saved because the Tories and Hague were so useless, because Tony had been okay on the road, and because we just about gripped the centre. But we were kidding ourselves if we thought it was a good campaign. I think we've had a very good campaign, and that's a tribute to an awful lot of people who've worked in that campaign. But I think, as people have said for years and years and years, campaigns are won right throughout. Woke up feeling really tired and went for a run. Loved the feeling of being out on my own with the wind gusting every now and then, and feeling I'd done all I could, and though it had not been perfect, we were definitely going to win.
Tony Blair arriving after...
Tony told me earlier he would be more confident because a second mandate is in some ways more powerful than the first. Plus he had learned and had experience of how to work the system.
Half-time interval in the England.
Why can't the moment of winning just be enjoyed? Tony because he's straight off focusing on the next thing. Me because of some general dourness defect that kicked in when everyone else was enjoying themselves. Weird.
Labour is back in government and back in business, but there's no time to pause and take stock. Problems have not evaporated.
After working round the clock for a few weeks, going the last few days without sleep, I was now straight back on the treadmill, and in circumstances where, because I was staying, Fiona and I were barely speaking, and when we did, it was to argue. She said that what made me good for him, driven and single-track and obsessive, is what made it difficult for her. I felt between a rock and a hard place. There were consequences to staying, but there were consequences to leaving too. Peyton f***ing place with knobs on. I asked Tony if he'd done a deal with Gordon. Not at all, he said, but he didn't rule it out. I wept because of the pressures I was under and the sadness I felt for Kelly's family. I did actually wonder whether what I discovered on reading my own diary would be so awful I would want to top myself. Once the dust had settled, I'd have to deal with the BBC, and I'd have no stomach for it. I hated these people.
That's tomorrow on BBC Two at the earlier time of 7. Next tonight, brand new Thursday night comedy kicks off with Dara O'Brien and Mock the Week. Meanwhile, on BBC 4 now, can charismatic African stars boost ratings inside the BBC World Service?